Okay, so there's been some pretty significant developments,
Right.
legally speaking, and it all revolves around the Trump administration and Venezuelan migrants.
Right.
But what's really interesting here is that we're seeing federal judges step in on what appears to be like a really fundamental question of constitutional rights.
Absolutely.
So we're going to deep dive into two related court actions that happened right around the same time. And they both center on the deportation of Venezuelans.
Yeah, and so you flagged two key developments that we're going to be talking about today. First, D.C. Federal District Court Judge James Boasberg just denied the Trump administration's request to withdraw his prior temporary restraining order,
Right.
which essentially would allow them to continue to deport Venezuelan migrants.
Exactly. So he's holding his ground on that initial decision. Now, almost at the same time, the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals was hearing oral arguments about that original restraining order. So basically, they were considering whether Judge Boasberg even had the authority to issue that order in the first place.
That's right.
So at the heart of this deep dive is this question. Can the executive branch use a centuries-old wartime law to potentially limit the due process rights of Venezuelan migrants? And then what role does the judiciary play in checking that power?
Right, and that's exactly the tension that we're seeing play out right now in these two courtrooms. And during those appellate court arguments, one of the judges made a statement that really kind of gave me chills, and I know it did for you as well. It was one of those, what you call justice goosebumps moments. We'll circle back to that later, I think.
We definitely will. But first, let's really focus on Judge Boasberg's new ruling. I mean, the New York Times summed it up pretty clearly in their headline. Judge maintains block on deportations of Venezuelans under wartime law. And what's crucial here is that Judge Boasberg's order ensures that these Venezuelan immigrants have a chance to challenge the accusation that they are members of a gang before they can be deported under this wartime law called the Alien Enemies Act. So this really brings the concept of due process into focus.
It does. Due process basically means fairness in legal proceedings. So it means that individuals have the right to be notified of the charges against them and then to have a chance to be heard to present their defense. So Judge Boasberg's 37-page order basically keeps that restraining order in place.
Right.
So these individuals can fight this claim that they belong to the Trendaragua gang, which is the Trump administration's justification for using this very old and rarely used law to try and deport them.
And let's not forget, this all started with Judge Boasberg's initial order back on March 15th. And that order temporarily blocked the administration's plan to use the Alien Enemies Act to deport these Venezuelans to a prison in El Salvador. And that original order really put a spotlight on the potential lack of due process they could face. I mean, it really makes you think about, the standard legal framework for immigration matters, which we know is the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act. The INA typically has a lot more established procedures and protections compared to this rarely used wartime Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, so
Okay, so we have the lower court really reinforcing this block on these deportations, really emphasizing the need for fundamental fairness. Especially when it comes to these gang affiliation allegations.
Right.
Now, let's turn our attention to that appellate court argument, because that's where we heard that remarkable statement.
yes.
So the DOJ lawyers are there presenting their case, arguing why Judge Boasberg's original restraining order should be overturned.
Yeah.
Their argument, basically, as I understand it, is that these Venezuelan migrants have very limited due process rights in this specific situation, given the national security concerns that they're raising. You're following along with the legal arguments, and then appeals court judge Patricia Millett drops this line. Nazis got better treatment, judge says, of Trump administration's Alien Enemies Act deportations.
Wow.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a minute.
Sure.
Comparing the Trump administration's actions under the Alien Enemies Act to the treatment of Nazis under that same act during wartime. So, I mean, that's a pretty profound comparison.
It really is. It makes you reconsider the historical weight of these legal tools.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah, and she went on to clarify that point. She said there were plane loads of people who were facing potential deportation, and she said no procedures in place to notify people. Her argument was basically that even during World War II, when the Alien Enemy Act was being used against individuals from enemy nations, there were at least more defined procedures in place than what the Trump administration was appearing to offer these Venezuelan migrants.
Right. So even in the context of, declared war and national security, it seems that there was at least an attempt to provide a baseline level of process that's seemingly absent here. It raises a lot of questions. Now let's circle back to Judge Boasberg's new ruling and really break down his reasoning for maintaining that restraining order. He lays out his legal arguments pretty systematically.
Yeah, he does. The case, as you mentioned, is JG et al. Versus Donald J. Trump et al. And Judge Boasberg talks about how in the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, March 15th, 5 Venezuelan non-citizens who were detained in Texas went to the court seeking emergency relief. They had a credible fear of imminent removal from the United States, and not under the standard immigration laws, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, but under this much older and rarely used Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
Yeah, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it's almost like a relic of a bygone era. And Judge Boasberg points out that it was last invoked after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, it's pretty extraordinary to see it being considered for use now.
Right.
It really makes you think about what the Founding Fathers envisioned when they included this possibility.
It does, and the act itself is pretty broad. It basically authorizes the president to just remove natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of a hostile nation or government. But there are specific conditions that have to be met. So either when there's a declared war between the United States and that nation, or when that nation has perpetrated or attempted or threatened an invasion, like a predatory incursion against the U.S.
So those are the two triggers, and Judge Boasberg really focuses his analysis on that very first sentence of the law.
He does. He quotes it directly. Whenever there is a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government. And his point is there is no declared war between the United States and Venezuela, and only Congress has the power to declare war. That's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution.
Right.
So no such declaration exists, meaning that the very first and most fundamental condition of the Alien Enemies Act has not been met.
That seems pretty straightforward. So according to Judge Boasberg, the administration hasn't cleared that first hurdle. But as you said, that first sentence also has a second part to it. It addresses any invasion or predatory incursion perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government.
Right, and that's the second part of his reasoning. He states that the U.S. has not been attacked or invaded by the government of Venezuela. Therefore, the second condition, triggering the Alien Enemies Act, also does not apply. So he says, just based on the plain language of the law itself, that the Trump administration's justification for using this act is legally insufficient.
So this ruling really highlights a key principle in our legal system. Even in matters of national security, the executive branch's power isn't absolute. The courts have a role to play, especially when individual liberty is at stake.
Exactly.
So just to be super clear, the Alien Enemies Act, as Judge Boasberg interprets it, can only be used if two conditions are met. One, there had to be a declared war or an invasion by a foreign nation. And two, the president has to issue a public proclamation. The people targeted must be 14 years or older, be from that specific nation, and not be naturalized U.S. citizens.
That's right. That's a good summary of the conditions that he outlines. But his legal reasoning doesn't end there. He goes on to say that even if those initial conditions were somehow considered to be met, the Venezuelan immigrants in this case are likely to succeed on another fundamental legal principle, and that is their right to individualized hearings.
Right.
They have the right to a process to determine whether the Alien Enemies Act even applies to them in the first place.
And this brings us back to, who exactly can be classified as an alien enemy under this law.
Right. And as Judge Boasberg points out, even the Department of Justice concedes that the awesome power of this act can only be used against those who are in fact alien enemies. And he cites precedent from both the Supreme Court and the Federal Circuit in saying that federal courts have the authority to review challenges to that designation.
Okay, so because these Venezuelan individuals are disputing the administration's claim that they're members of the Trendaragua gang, which is the basis for trying to deport them under this act, Judge Boasberg is saying they can't be deported under this specific law until a court has actually ruled on the validity of that accusation. It boils down to due process, the right of individuals to challenge the government's claims against them.
And this leads us to the Trump administration's response to these actions, which has been reported to include the assertion that Judge Boasberg's rulings would effectively allow murderers to roam free.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
And, some commentary has pointed out that Judge Boasberg himself has a background as a federal homicide prosecutor.
Right.
So he's someone whose career has been about upholding the rule of law, ensuring justice, while also, being very familiar with and respecting the rights of defendants under our system.
Right.
I think that context is worth keeping in mind.
Absolutely. And Judge Boasberg addresses that accusation directly in his ruling. He says that neither of his temporary restraining orders, the initial oral one, nor the subsequent written order, required the release of any individual. Plus, he points out his orders didn't prevent the government from making new apprehensions under the president's proclamation, neither did they prevent the government from pursuing deportations through other legal avenues like the INA.
Right. So he's basically saying, look, you have perfectly legal and established ways to deport these individuals if they meet the criteria.
Right.
My order simply pauses the use of this specific wartime law without basic due process. They have to have a fair chance to challenge the accusations against them.
Exactly.
So Judge Boasberg's message to the Trump administration is, you have to operate within the bounds of the law and the Constitution. If you believe these people are deportable, you need to follow the procedures, which include providing notice and a chance to be heard. So just to kind of bring it all together, we've seen Judge Boasberg not only reaffirm his initial decision to block these deportations under the Alien Enemies Act, but also lay out a detailed legal rationale explaining why he thinks the administration's attempt to use this specific wartime law in this context is just legally questionable, mainly because the conditions of the act, a declared war or an invasion, haven't been met. And on top of all of that, he's stressing the importance of due process. You know, the right of these individuals to challenge the accusations before being deported.
Right. And then you have that statement from the appellate court by Judge Millett.
Yeah.
That really stark comparison to the treatment of Nazis. It really makes you think about the concerns within the judiciary about the administration's approach here and the possibility of executive overreach when it comes to immigration. I mean, at the core of this tension, you have the Trump administration trying to use a rarely invoked wartime statute for immigration enforcement, possibly sidestepping due process safeguards, and you have the judiciary trying to protect constitutional rights and make sure everyone gets a fair legal process.
It really does make you think about the balance between national security and individual rights. And the fact that they're using a law from 1798 in the 21st century raises some big questions about how it applies today and the historical implications. I mean, are there long-term impacts from these interpretations? How does this affect the power dynamic between the executive and judicial branches? It's really something to think about.
A lot to consider.
It really is.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.